Chris Lord in Los Angeles, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Daily on Monocle 24. In Russia, President Vladimir Putin has announced the imminent end of what he called a partial mobilization, the dispatch of 300,000 debatably enthusiastic and haphazardly equipped reservists to shore up what President Putin still refers to as Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. In remarks likely to reassure few, he said that no further call-ups were planned in the foreseeable future. Since about February 24th, foreseeing the future has not been Putin's long suit. It also remains an open question whether or not Putin's mobilization order has prompted more Russians to go to other countries than go to Ukraine. Well, I'm joined with more on how this looks from inside Russia by Monocle's Polina Morova. Polina, you were able to go to Russia because you are Russian as recently as September. Can you give us some sort of sense of how this situation looks to people inside Russia, especially if they're getting their information from Russian media?
Honestly, I was very surprised because going home was very scary. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know where conversations would go because from speaking with my friends and people I know before, it's two ways mostly. It's either you against it or you are out of it. And I think sadly I discovered that the life in Russia was very normal, a bit too normal for what's going on in the rest of the world. And most of my friends, the way I sensed it is that they are scared. Either they give up or they're scared, because I remember in February there was so much going on and people were protesting and people were very active on social media despite the threats, whereas now I think because of this huge risk that people carry when expressing their opinion, if it's the one of opposition, it's very difficult to do anything. And I think most people don't realize that they don't actually have to just be on the streets. There's so many more things that they can be active through. But as I said, I looked at Russia through this ugly lens of the war and of it not just being my home, but being a country where people are ignorant. But then again, I speak from a very privileged position of having a life in in London. And it's very difficult for me because I can't really empathize with either.
So is there quite a widespread thing of people just deciding that if I ignore it, it'll go away?
I think they just hope that it's going to be over soon, and they don't believe that it depends on them as well. Because people in Russia, they just never had any sort of participation in what the government does. And I think growing up, it was not a question whether you are political or whether you're apolitical. People are just used to not having any voice. And I think now, all of a sudden, when everything is dependent on their voice, it's very strange and difficult because it's almost as if they expect that now they have to do something, but they think, well, what do I need to do now if I didn't do anything for the 30 years that I've been living here?
The mobilisation, of course, does directly affect a great many people, not least, well, most obviously the 222,000 so far that President Putin says have been mobilised, and I guess that leaves about 78,000 still to be mobilised. What's your sense since you returned of how that has affected the way people are responding to this? Are you hearing from your circle, and especially about people your own age, of people just deciding, okay, that's it, and trying to leave the country?
Well, first of all, the numbers that are presented to the European media, I think, are very undermining the actual amount of people getting mobilized. And I remember when it was first announced, someone told me that who has a contact in the government of Tatarstan, where I'm from, about that they had to collect 3,000 people by the next morning, so in one day.
That doesn't sound like they're being terribly picky about who they're collecting.
No, and that's exactly, I think they're very desperate and having this legal description of a person who would be conscripted is total nonsense, because ultimately someone I know works in a hospital told me how patients get subscripted from their hospital bed, even being over 60, and it's actually ridiculous. And there's obviously always rumors about people being trying to get subscripted at the protests and being arrested, and then lawyers who actually go to take the cases from the ones being arrested at the protest also are getting subscripted. So it's just surreal, you know.
That's probably a good word to describe what the last 8 months have been like for somebody in your position, and we should emphasise that you also have family in Ukraine as well, a description which of course applies to many millions of people. But for the last 8 months, you will have seen here in London the Western media tying itself in knots, trying to understand Russia or trying to learn about Russia or trying to explain Russia. When you've been consuming that as an actual Russian, does it strike you that there's anything that we're not understanding, that we don't get right, a point we keep missing?
I think it's very difficult to translate this feeling of feeling responsible for what's happening, but then not turn it into guilt, because I think feeling guilty makes you very passive, and whereas I guess feeling responsible prompts some sort of action, and most people in Russia, they are just lost. And I think what media maybe doesn't understand or wouldn't understand, I'm not talking about just media, I'm just talking about people who don't have an insider vision or even a connection to any sort of Russian person. What you wouldn't understand is how it's really heavy. Constantly, it's really heavy, and it's like always in the back of your head what is happening. All these images from Ukraine, all this data about how many people die, all these words that Zelensky says in every single speech he has. It's always, you carry it with you every single minute of your day, but you can't do anything about it. So it's just, that's where I think I can empathize with people back home who are just living their best life, because otherwise you just go crazy.
Poli, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Daily on Monocle 24, and it has been a big week for Elon Musk. But when isn't it? He kicked things off by saying Taiwan should be